They boarded the ships, believing they were marching into darkness. German soldiers captured in North Africa had been told that America was collapsing, divided, soft, and drowning in chaos. Nazi propaganda described the United States as a place of crime, poverty, racial weakness, and moral decay. According to Berlin, the American system was fragile, corrupt, and ready to break at any moment. So the Germans expected nothing more than crude camps, brutal guards, hunger, and humiliation. As the ships crossed the Atlantic, many of the prisoners comforted themselves with that picture. Yes, they had lost a campaign. Yes, they were heading into enemy territory. But they believed that behind the American factories and bombers, there was only weakness. They would see proof, they told each other, that the Reich was still the stronger, more disciplined, more advanced society. Then, the coastline appeared. Instead of the disorder they expected, the prisoners saw ships moving in and out of enormous ports like pieces in a well-oiled machine. Cargo cranes lifted massive loads with ease. Trains rolled past in endless lines. Trucks flashed by on wide roads. Workers moved with purpose, energy, and confidence. It was not a nation on the brink of collapse. It was something entirely different, something few of them had imagined. One captured corporal stared at the port in disbelief and whispered to another prisoner, "If this is decay, what does strength look like?" The other man didn't answer. He was too busy watching the cranes dance above the harbor like steel giants. Yet the true moment of transformation did not come at the docks. It began during the long train ride that carried the prisoners from the eastern seaboard into the heart of the United States. After processing at the port, the Germans were marched to passenger cars, real passenger cars, not cattle wagons, padded seats, windows, even fans overhead. They expected chains and wooden floors. Instead, they sat like tourists. And that alone felt like an insult to everything they had been told. As the train pulled away and darkness wrapped around the countryside, the German POWs pressed their faces to the windows, unable to look away. What they saw contradicted every belief they had carried across the ocean. Small towns, scattered across the landscape, glowed with electric light even late at night. Houses lit up from within, barns and porches shining, neon signs flickering above diners, street lamps stretching in lines along quiet roads, entire communities sparkling as if darkness had no power here. In Germany, blackout regulations had turned cities and villages into oceans of shadow. Here, night looked like a softer version of day. A soldier from Hamburg tightened his grip on the seat and muttered, "We were told America had no discipline, no order, and yet everything glows." The man next to him shook his head and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The train passed factories working through the night, long brick buildings with rows of illuminated windows, smoke and steam rising steadily into the sky. Parking lots filled with hundreds of personal cars stunned the prisoners. In Germany, private vehicles were rare luxuries. In America, they were tools of ordinary workers, men and women who drove them every day without ceremony. One of the POWs who had grown up in a working-class family whispered, "There are more cars here than in our entire town." At a small station, the train stopped briefly for water and fuel. The German prisoners watched American railway workers perform maintenance with remarkable speed. They joked, laughed, smoked cigarettes, and drank cold soda from glass bottles. For the Germans, whose families back home were scraping for crumbs, this casual waste was almost painful to witness. A sergeant watched an American worker crush a half-eaten sandwich in his fist and throw it away. Under his breath, he said, "My children would fight over that." The train moved deeper into the country. Through the windows, the POWs saw farms unlike anything in Europe. Fields stretching to the horizon. Machinery larger than entire German farmyards. Silos filled to bursting, barns with electric lights and running water. Children riding on tractors more advanced than the equipment used by the German army. They passed grain elevators that looked like fortresses, towering over endless seas of wheat and corn. One farmer's son from Bavaria leaned closer to the glass as they passed a massive field where a single combine harvester moved in wide, patient arcs. He thought, that one machine could do the work of my entire village. For the first time, he began to understand that this war was not just about courage or tactics. It was about scale. By the time the train arrived at the POW camps in Texas, Oklahoma, and the Midwest, the prisoners had already begun to question everything they had been told. But nothing prepared them for what they saw next. They expected crude barracks, cold, dark, overcrowded, and miserable. They imagined straw on the floor, broken windows, and guards with rifle butts ready at every door. Instead, they found wooden buildings with clean beds, functioning showers, heating, electric lights, and even recreation spaces. The barracks were simple but solid, built faster than anything in Germany, yet more comfortable than many homes they had left behind. The medical clinics left them speechless. There were X-ray machines, surgical tools, cabinets stocked with bandages and medicines, refrigerators full of supplies that German hospitals had not seen since early in the war. A captured German doctor walked through one of the infirmaries and said quietly, "If our wounded received treatment like this, half of them would still be alive." He ran his hand along the smooth metal of an examination table and felt something unfamiliar: envy. But the greatest shock waited in the kitchens. American POW camps fed enemy soldiers according to regulations that required abundant, nutritious meals. Prisoners assigned to kitchen duty discovered walk-in refrigerators the size of rooms, shelves stacked with fresh vegetables, milk, eggs, meat, and bread. They saw massive gas ovens, electric mixers, and industrial dishwashers humming like machines in a factory. For many of them, it was the first time in years they had seen food in such quantity and variety in one place. The menu changed regularly: meat dishes, soups, potatoes, vegetables, porridge, bread, jam, and coffee. Some days the prisoners ate better than they had even in peacetime Germany. But what stunned them most was not the abundance, it was the waste. American regulations demanded that cooks prepare more than necessary to ensure no prisoner went hungry. Whatever remained untouched was thrown away. One German sergeant stood still, holding a tray of uneaten bread, shaking. His wife and children were standing in ration lines back home, while he was being asked to discard food. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered, "How can this be real?" The American cook supervising him frowned sympathetically and said, "Rules are rules, buddy. Everyone eats. That's the deal." For the sergeant, it felt less like a rule and more like a message from another planet. Then came Christmas. In December 1943, churches, youth groups, and ordinary American families sent hundreds of thousands of Christmas packages to German prisoners. These weren't military rations, these were gifts: chocolate, candy, books, razors, games, socks, homemade cookies wrapped in wax paper, notes written in careful handwriting wishing peace, safety, and a quick end to the war. In several camps, American choirs arrived to sing Christmas songs in German: Stille Nacht, O Tannenbaum, Familiar melodies drifting across the wire. Women brought freshly baked cakes. Children delivered handmade cards decorated with stars, angels, and clumsy drawings of Christmas trees. Some prisoners stood frozen, unable to accept the idea that their enemies were sending them kindness, not hatred. One lieutenant, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, stared at a small card made by an American boy. On it, the child had written, "To a German soldier, I hope you can go home soon." The lieutenant felt something inside him break. Later he wrote, "If this is our enemy, then everything we believed was madness." Yet that was not the end of their education. As the labor shortage grew in 1944, thousands of POWs were assigned to work on American farms and in civilian factories. Under guard, but unblindfolded, they traveled by truck through the American heartland. They saw endless fields heavy with crops. They saw water towers, silos, and irrigation systems. They saw towns with movie theaters, schools, churches, and stores overflowing with goods. On farms, they saw machines that transformed agriculture. A single combine harvester replaced the work of hundreds of men. American farmers produced yields that Europe could only dream of. A 16-year-old farm boy operated a tractor more advanced than anything in the German army's inventory. He waved at the prisoners as he passed by, dust swirling in the sun behind him. In factories, the shock deepened. POWs saw women building engines and machinery with skill and precision. They saw Black Americans operating cranes, welding steel, running complex equipment. They saw elderly men and young boys managing logistics, tracking supplies and supervising production lines. And everything worked. Everything functioned smoothly. The prisoners realized the truth. A society they had been taught to consider weak and degenerate was producing more wealth, more technology, more food, more machinery, and more comfort than the Reich had ever imagined. The Nazi image of a chaotic, broken America simply evaporated in the face of reality. One prisoner, formerly a committed believer in Nazi racial theory, watched a group of women assemble electrical components in a factory. Their hands moved quickly, precisely, soldering, testing, and packing parts for shipment. Everything we were told about race and ability, he later admitted, was a lie. American workers earned wages the POWs could not comprehend. Their homes had refrigerators, radios, electric stoves, and heating systems. Their children went to school instead of hiding in basements. Their stores overflowed with food even during wartime. Their lives seemed relaxed, confident, and full of possibility. It was not a perfect world, but compared to bombed-out German cities and ration cards, it might as well have been another universe. Freedom was not chaos. Diversity was not weakness. Democracy was not inefficiency. The German prisoners, step by step, saw that America worked not because of harsh discipline or fear, but because ordinary people were empowered to think, create, and contribute. The Americans did not try to hide their problems either. In the camp libraries, POWs could read American newspapers and magazines. They saw political cartoons criticizing leaders, articles debating government policies, and reports on strikes, protests, and social issues. In Nazi Germany, such open criticism would have meant prison or death. In America, it was part of daily life. Some prisoners attended classes organized in the camps, English lessons, history lectures, discussions about democracy and economics. Professors from universities wrote materials or even visited to teach. Prisoners who had never thought deeply about politics before began to ask questions. What if the strength of a country really did come from its citizens, not from fear and obedience? But the final breaking point came in 1945. When American officials showed prisoners the first photographs and films from liberated concentration camps, many refused to believe it.
They insisted it had to be Allied propaganda, an exaggeration, a staged show. It could not be real. It could not come from the same Germany they had sworn to serve. Then letters from home began to arrive. Friends, relatives, former neighbors, all reporting horrors, mass graves, starving prisoners, smoke rising from camps they had once thought were simply labor facilities. Some men collapsed where they stood. Others cried openly for the first time in years. A few tore the last remaining photos of themselves in uniform into tiny pieces and let the shreds fall like ash. One soldier wrote in his diary, "I did not lose faith in Hitler because America was strong. I lost faith because Germany had become unrecognizable." When the war ended, German POWs began returning to a devastated homeland. Cities were in ruins, factories smashed, fields neglected, families scattered or gone. The 1,000-year Reich had not even survived 12. But the men who stepped off the ships and trains in 1946 were not the same men who had left Germany years earlier. They carried with them a deep understanding of how a free society functioned. They had witnessed a nation built on opportunity rather than oppression, on cooperation rather than domination. They had seen that treating even enemies with a basic level of dignity was not a sign of weakness, but of confidence.
Many of them became teachers, engineers, farmers, and public officials in post-war Germany. They brought home modern agricultural techniques, industrial methods, and democratic values. They taught others what they had seen, that a society thrives when it empowers its people, when it embraces technology and openness, when it respects the dignity of individuals instead of dividing them into ranks of worthiness. A former POW later said, "America defeated us twice, first with weapons, then with the truth. And the second victory was stronger." He meant that bombs and bullets could end a war, but reality, the undeniable, visible reality of a successful democracy, could change minds. German soldiers arrived in the United States as enemies, convinced of their own superiority and of the inevitable victory of their system. They left as witnesses, witnesses to a world that shattered their illusions, broke their loyalty to a tyrant, and showed them another path. Their journey reveals a profound truth. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a bomb, not a tank, not a rifle, but simple reality. Reality that cannot be argued away when it is seen with one's own eyes. Reality that turns enemies into learners, skeptics into believers, and prisoners into men capable of rebuilding a nation from ruins. The German POWs saw the real America. They saw light where they expected darkness, abundance where they expected scarcity, and humanity where they expected cruelty. That vision changed them forever, and in that change lay the first fragile foundations of a different Germany, one that would rise not through conquest, but through learning what freedom could create.